Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 400 library systems across the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with all of the amazing authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, I am honored to host NPR legal affairs correspondent and New York Times bestselling author Nina Totenberg as she chats with us about her book, Dinners with Ruth, a memoir on the power of friendships. Welcome, Nina. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I know that everybody's super excited to get started. I can tell by all of the amazing questions that we've already received, but let me pause to kind of give everybody that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly. Then we'll get things rolling. So I have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but you can also submit questions during the entirety of the live talk by clicking that questions button that's just below the live stream video. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we'll get to as many questions as time allows. And if you have to leave early, don't worry. All registrants will receive a link to the recording via email in about 24 hours. Now, to formally introduce our guest, a guest who needs no introduction, I presume. Nina Totenberg is NPR's award-winning legal affairs correspondent. She appears on NPR's critically acclaimed news magazines, All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and Weekend Edition, and on NPR podcasts, including the NPR Politics podcast and its series, The Docket. Totenberg's Supreme Court and legal coverage has won her every major journalism award in broadcasting. Recognized 7 times by the American Bar Association for continued excellence in legal reporting, she's received more than 24 honorary degrees. A frequent TV contributor, she writes for major newspapers, magazines, and law reviews. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm very good. I'm glad to be with you, and I don't know how many others there are out there, but hopefully a lot.
There are a lot, let me tell you. People are very excited about hearing from you today. So again, thank you for taking the time out of your day, especially in this kind of busy, exciting time for a legal.
A little more exciting than I might like. This used to be a fairly stately beat. You could even make doctor's appointments and hair appointments and know that you were quite sure that you could show up to those things. That's not true anymore. You have no idea what they're going to do, when they're going to do it. And even late at night, you may get a call from the court. I may get a call from the court saying the court has just released an order and we've sent it to you. And the order is something that makes news.
Well, all I can hope for is some breaking news while you're on with us today.
No. I'd have to leave you.
No. Just read it to us. No. Okay. So, of course, we did get a fair amount of questions about kind of the difference in reporting on the Supreme Court when you first started versus now. Megan from Sacramento Public Library wants to know how the Supreme Court over even the last 5 years is different from SCOTUS of the past, if at all. Is it easier? Is it harder to report now? What do you think?
It's much harder now, and for a variety of reasons. Some of them are reflective of a very conservative court with a 6-3 supermajority that has 3 Trump appointees. And even before there were 3 of them, there were 2 of them. And it meant that all during the Trump administration, the Trump Justice Department was very aggressive about going to the Supreme Court. And unlike in previous years, the court was pretty willing to bail them out, or at least to consider the cases that they wanted to get heard on a very fast track, much faster than before. So the sort of killer statistic is that in the 8 years of the George W. Bush administration and in the 8 years of the Obama administration, there were a total of 16, that is 8 for each, each administration, cases in which the court agreed to hear a case on the so-called shadow docket, that is, ahead of the time that would normally have taken place. So they leapfrogged over a lower court, and they got a stay blocking something from for something to happen. That happened only 8 times in the Bush 2 administrations and 8 times in the Obama administration. And I think if I remember correctly, it was like 41 in the Trump
Oh my
administration.
goodness.
And it has not ceased in the Biden administration, because, of course, during the Trump administration, there were a lot of judges appointed to the lower courts who are equally conservative. And that has sort of been a hydraulic push, particularly from a couple of circuits, mainly the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in the Deep South, that have, even if there are like lots of other circuit courts that have ruled differently, all you need is one court to say, no, we don't agree, and we're going for a very aggressive point of view, and it's different than everybody else, and therefore there's a conflict in the circuits, and therefore if you want to, one side or the other is appealing to the Supreme Court, and in this case it's the Biden administration saying this has long been the prerogative of the executive branch or some other thing. Mm-hmm. And it means that it's a very packed docket of very controversial issues. And the Trump cases are not an exception. And I think you're beginning to see some of what is undoubtedly even going on in the Supreme Court itself, disagreements about how to proceed, whether to entertain all of these cases. Mm-hmm. You're beginning to see, and the approaches, you're beginning to see some of that sort of filter out in an odd sort of way into the public, because you can see that the court heard the should Trump be the states be able to eliminate Trump from the ballot case. I think they heard that and disposed of it in something like 10 weeks. Now we have way more than that to wait for a decision in the immunity case. Mm-hmm. And that may very likely mean even, that even if the court were to say that a former president is not immune for his actions while in office, that there isn't time left for the various trials that could go forward if you'd had 6 months more. And 6 months ago, between Jack Smith, the special counsel, in December, asked the court he tried to leapfrog. They said, no, just let this proceed. So it went to the Court of Appeals, and then it went to the court. And they've taken what some people have characterized as a reasonably speedy approach to this, and others have viewed as a take your own sweet time amount of time to do this. Mm-hmm.
What do you like? It sounds like historically it's still a much faster pace than usual.
Oh, it's a way faster pace. Yeah. And for people who cover the court, not only is the court itself different, what we do is different. I used to report for All Things Considered when mm-hmm. I was first working at NPR. Then we added Morning Edition. Then we added a midday program. Then we added digital. Then we added podcasts, and now we have newsletters, and on and on. And it seems like your day is never done, because there's always another platform for you to report on for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so not to mention all of the other kind of news outlets that you report on here and there.
Well, when I do that, it's just sort of a quick hit. But really, my daily work is I do something that now routinely at the end of the term that I never used to do. Because of digital, I pre-write various possibilities for how a case will turn out. And 9 times out of 10, I've covered all the possibilities, but it may be 5 or 6 different versions, and they're very different. And it's a lot of work to produce one digital story. In the end will be one digital story. So my job is very different.
And you're going to keep doing it forever, right?
No, but I'm not a person who believes in retirement until I think I really can't do it. I feel like a little bit, this is like something that Justice Ginsburg used to say, as long as I can go full steam, I'll be doing the job. Well, I don't, being a justice is a little different than being a reporter. It is, and so I don't know how long I can do it, but I'm going to do it for a while anyway.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a noticeable similarity that you and Justice Ginsburg have, is the continuing full steam ahead. So in Dinners with Ruth, a memoir on the power of friendships, right here on my little tabs.
And which just came out also in paperback. Although I do think it's a really good hardback present to give.
All around. I've also been listening to, I've read it both in print and listened to it. It always adds something, the audio, but we were talking about that before we came on. But so this is a book about more than just your friendship with the late Supreme Court Justice, right? It's about female friendships with your sisters, with your actual sisters, your NPR sisters, and even other men and women that you've held close friendships with along the years.
Yeah.
But it's also this memoir, this gripping account memoir of your life in journalism. Is that right?
Well, I came of age and wanted to become a journalist at a time when people felt perfectly free to say that they didn't hire women. Now, very quickly, the law changed, but practices didn't change. And so the women of my generation, we didn't really, we weren't thinking about cracking the glass ceiling. We just wanted a foot in the door, because up until then we couldn't get jobs. And we all like to joke that there's a reason that there are so many women at NPR. And in the beginning, there were the ratio of women to men was even bigger, and that's because no man would work for the amount they paid us in the beginning. They really paid us terribly. Horribly. And men didn't want to work for that little money. And we were glad to have a job, in the early 80s. We were just glad to have a job.
Mm-hmm. You talk a bit about the fallopian jungle.
That's what's up. Well, eventually, of course, Cokie Roberts and Linda Wertheimer and we sat together in a corner of the office. And we even kidnapped a couch for that corner of the office. And when women would have problems that they wanted to discuss, they would come over to our couch to discuss them. And some of the men dubbed it the fallopian jungle.
Well, the name fits. That's okay. So
I considered it honorific.
Jane from Westland Public Library is asking, what inspired you to write about the power of friendships? How did it come to be? I think you said in your dedication something about your husband apologizing for talking you into it. So I'm sure there's a story there.
There's a story. So I am really, I often say this, I'm a deadline dick. I like doing a daily story, occasionally an analytical story. I hate enormous projects. And for years, I had refused to even entertain any idea of writing a book. And then I got a call from Simon & Schuster, and I said I was not interested in writing a book. And I said I was not interested in writing a book. And finally, the person who called me said, well, would you be willing to talk to the CEO, Jonathan Karp? And I said, well, it would be churlish to say I wouldn't talk to the CEO of a major publishing house. Of course, I'll talk to him. And we had a Zoom call, because at the time I think we were still, I don't think we were back at work yet, anywhere. And I I said to him, I'm not taking a vacation from my job, and I can't, I, I, I not only don't want to write a book, I don't have the time to write a book, and I most of all don't have an idea.
Mm.
So, and just about that moment, my husband walked up to the attic where my office was and is, and I said, "Come on and sit down." And so he started going through all of my objections, and he said, "We won't give you a deadline. P.S. They asked me if I could get it done by February, the minute I signed the contract." And I had a lot of objections, but my ace in the hole was that my husband really didn't want me to write a book. I work too hard as it is, he says, and he wants some of my time. He didn't want me working all the time. And we get down to and then Jonathan, it was really Jonathan's idea, the idea of writing about the power of friendships, especially among the women of my era. And he laid it out way better than I just did. And but I still didn't want to write the book. And I went to my ace in the hole, and I literally had my mouth open to say, and my husband doesn't want me to write a book, and I value my marriage more than I value my, whatever else I might want to do. And I had my mouth open to say that. And my husband says, "I think you ought to write this book." Ah! And so the book was born that way. And then they, of course, paid me well to do it. And, his idea was, at least, when I looked to see how many pieces I'd done at NPR, and that didn't cover my career before I came to NPR, I had done 9,000 pieces. Wow. So I couldn't even read them all. So this was a way that was navigable, that I could manage. And I did have thoughts about friendships and about family and about professionalism. Mm-hmm. And so this gave me an ability to write a book that wasn't, a great legal treatise, let's put it that way.
Something that everybody wanted to read. I can say that because I've read too many legal treatises myself. Not as many as you, but okay. So what about then kind of that writing process? Because it has to be, a completely different way of writing. Sharon says, does journalistic writing have any impact on your creative writing and vice versa? So I guess what's different or even challenging about writing a memoir as opposed to your journalistic writings?
Well, I do think that Mr. Karp did give me essentially a big idea that helped frame it. I had somebody who helped me basically think it through and outline it. And then I had to put it into my voice, that idea. And I kept adding stuff and taking stuff out too, that I thought nobody really cares about that. Or I don't want to say that. In journalism, you just have to say some things, but if I didn't want to say it, I didn't say it. Mm-hmm. So but mainly getting it done was the hardest part. I think it was in 2021. I went for our family vacation in Jamaica, and every day I went to the beach with the family, my family, an extended family, and in the afternoon I came back and I wrote until about 6 o'clock at night. Hmm. And I did it on weekends, and I did it at night, and I did it for, when you write a book, you find out that you have multiple drafts that you have to do, and it's hard work, and I have no intention of doing it again.
I'm sure you have plenty more stories to tell, Nina.
Mm.
Excuse me. So you write in the book that Nancy Drew, you were a big Nancy Drew lover as a child. Was that your primary formative kind of inspiration into journalism and wanting to be a reporter? Why journalism?
I think that if you talk to most women, and not just of my age, but younger, by 10 or 20 years, they all pop out with Nancy Drew. Sonia Sotomayor popped out with Nancy Drew at her confirmation hearing. I mean, there were so few female role models that when there were those kinds of role models, and Nancy Drew was the primary one, um, millions of young women fixated on them. And Nancy Drew was, think of all the things she had going for her. First of all, she didn't have a mother. Her mother had died, apparently, because her father was a, quote, widower. And so she didn't even have to compete with a mother for her father's attention. There are no siblings. There's a cute boyfriend. She has a hot car. And she can do all kinds of physical things like a jackknife dive. And she's a sleuth. She's a sleuth. And I sometimes think that part of what I do is being a sleuth or a high class gossip or an analytic person, or just a person who says this is what happened today. It is a great honor to be able to do that, to be able to tell people in some form of narrative what happened today. You're the first person maybe that they're hearing, and or the first person that they're scrolling through the NPR website and they see, just before we did this about an hour ago, the Supreme Court announced when it would hear the Trump immunity case, and it picked the latest date possible. And so that's news. It's not big news. It's, but it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell interesting stuff.
That you do. Interestingly, in the book, you talk about being one of the only women in basically all of your jobs until you got to NPR.
Mm-hmm.
And you're very candid with having to deal with some sexual assault and harassment, and inappropriate behavior from your male counterparts. But in the same breath, you kind of shrug it off as mores of the time and what you had to go through. And even talk about some of them trying to come into your hotel room at the end of the night when you're on tour. Yeah.
You just had to suck it up.
But were you ever afraid? Because you're telling it and it's outwardly, you don't sound scared.
I never thought I was going to be assaulted. I mean, the technical definition of assault, I can touch you on the shoulder and I've assaulted you. But when I'm talking about assault, I'm talking about rape or something very close to rape. Mm-hmm. And that never happened to me. But you really had to be tough about it, because otherwise it would get impossible. And sometimes it was very lonely. When I first started out and I was in my early 20s and I was covering the New Hampshire primary, and all the reporters on the bus, on the campaign bus, were men. Occasionally there was one woman, a columnist named Mary Ann Means, who was on board, but most of the time they were all men. I was young, they didn't know me, I wasn't part of the boys club. They had no interest really in including me in their club. And one day, and I tell this story in the book, Nan Robertson from the New York Times walked on board, and I was sitting alone because nobody was sitting with me. And she walked right over and plunked herself down and said, "Can I sit here?" And I said, "Yes, you can sit here." And she became a friend until her death.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, by the way. I'm sorry you and women of your time and those before had to endure kind of such behavior to lay the groundwork to get us where we are today. But even you writing the book, I was like, wow, you just don't sound like it. You sound very brave.
Well, it didn't feel brave at the time. It felt I was determined. And so you have choices. Either
Right.
you do it or you don't. And there have been times when I have occasionally been brave, but most of the time I was ambitious. And if you're ambitious, you just have to you decide that you're going to do this and that obstacles that are put in your way, you cannot let deter you.
Mhm.
Otherwise, your ambition will never be fulfilled.
Sage advice. Lisa is stating, I loved the book and your report, and I love your reporting for NPR. Thank you. You mentioned that women had difficulty finding jobs and in many cases were underemployed when you were starting your career. How have obstacles to women changed throughout your career?
Oh, well, it's like night and day now. And, you know, there is no job that women have no chance of getting. Uh, I remember when I won the Peabody Award, which is a big, prestigious journalism award, and I was up there receiving the award, and on the dais behind me were all the board members of the Peabody Committee or whatever it was, and they were all men. And I turned around just before I left the stage, and I said, "And maybe one day there'll be a skirt back there too." And I'm sure there are many skirts on the Peabody Committee today. I didn't check today, but it was you. But today, really, there is almost no position that you can't aspire to. Um, I think that the hardest thing about journalism today is that there are multiple newspapers every week that are dying,
Mm.
and and cutbacks at most news organizations, and even online, fairly big and prestigious news organizations failing because people don't read, don't listen nearly as much as they do TikTok. That's where lots of people get their information. It may be completely unreliable information, and they don't understand that, and they don't understand the damage of that.
Mhm.
But that is, I think, a far greater threat to us all than um, the discrimination against women that has long existed.
Mhm.
But it's really so much better today that it's hard to it's hard. I think it's hard to complain that for most women today. You might complain about conditions or something like that, but the kind of discrimination that existed even 15 years ago
Mhm.
does no longer exist.
Mhm. So you parallel yours and Justice Ginsburg's lives throughout the duration of your book, kind of starting with birth, even, and the differences and similarities of how you both grew up. Um, and then moving into early career, both being in fields of journalism and law, again, where there were few women. Do you think that these similarities and experiences were kind of building a framework to a rich friendship that neither of you knew was coming?
I
Without those
think
similarities, would you have had the same friendship?
it's hard to know. It was a friendship that developed over time. When I first knew her, she became a phone pal of mine. She was in New York. I was in Washington. I was just assigned to cover the Supreme Court, and I really had no idea what I was doing. And she became, at first, I called her about what turned out to be the first Supreme Court brief that she wrote. And then I would call her about cases that she argued and cases that were involving, at the time, she was the architect of the fight for women's rights, and that was very prevalent in what I was covering. So I would talk to her a lot. But then she moved, so I got to know her eventually, and I won't bore you with the story. It's in the book. And but I did have the sense that we were both very much on the outside looking in when we first met. And that became even more. Then she moved to Washington, and she was on the DC Circuit for 13 years before she was named to the Supreme Court. But in the years prior to her moving to Washington, I think we shared a determination and a feeling that we were on the outside looking in. And then when she moved to Washington, increasingly, we became, over the years, close friends. And by the time, at the time of her death, we'd been friends for almost 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And now I know that Ruth had hundreds, if not thousands, of other friends who could probably tell similar stories. But I think we felt, particularly towards the end of her life, very, very close.
It's something that interested me in the book. You write that Marty asked you to write a letter to Justice Ginsburg for her 50th birthday that he was going to kind of put in a binder for her to read through from all of her closest friends. But you didn't realize it was a closest friends binder at first, and you made it a point to write out your full name.
Well, I did realize that he had. I mean, I don't know why I did that. It's an odd thing to have done, because he said from her good friends. He said, I'm asking her good friends to write notes, and I'm going to put them together for her in a book. And so I heard that in my frontal lobe, but I apparently didn't hear it in the back lobe because I signed it Nina Totenberg. Now that's just silly. And I, when I was writing the book, I asked her daughter, Jane, if she had that, could she send it to me? Because I didn't keep a copy of it. I didn't know I was, this would be important to me at some point. And she did. And it's sort of a thing that I think women still do. I think that the thing about women today that is still there, and it was there in even greater proportions when I was younger, is that we don't have enough confidence in ourselves. Mm-hmm. So my memory was that I didn't write a very good note, but I read the note and it's actually quite good. It's not, it's not boom, but it's a very nice, and it's a thoughtful note. And that wasn't my memory of it. I felt not up to the task. Mm-hmm. And after all, if it was Ruth's 50th birthday, I was still in my late 30s. And so I had succeeded to some measure already, but I didn't have any sense of that. And I have talked with lots of women who, it's the reason when they do studies of who gets bigger raises. Mm-hmm. They never ask for, I should not say never, but the numbers show that women don't ask for raises as often or for as much. Men feel very entitled to ask for a raise. And I remember my niece, Emily, who is a reporter now today, when she was first in college, she said to me one day, she said, Neens, how come the boys don't do the reading, but they do all the talking, and the girls do the reading and they don't do the talking? I said, that's what your generation is supposed to fix. So, and but I think there is something that makes men have more confidence at an earlier stage in their lives.
Be testosterone. That can't be the only thing, though.
No, I don't know. It's very hard to know. It's, they may have been little princes in their homes. Their mothers may have taught them that they are Great Americans who are entitled to whatever.
Well, I'm sure that this would be a great discussion for a dinner party. Um, Katie, Katie's asking, "Hi Nina, I loved reading your book Dinners with Ruth last summer, and it was such a feel-good book. I was wondering if you still do dinners or dinner parties with anyone important in Washington D.C. where you can discuss these important topics."
We do. I couldn't do it without my husband, who's a wonderful chef, and but we do, and we like giving dinner parties. But we have friends who who we want to spend time with, and they are some of them journalists, and some of them doctors, and some of them lawyers, lots of them lawyers and judges, and they're just like the rest of us. At least the ones who are our friends are just like the rest of us. And a few of them have very big positions, but that's not why they're at the dinner table. They're at the dinner table because they're interesting and they're nice, and you can have a real conversation.
That's what's important. But Justice Ginsburg wasn't the first judge you hosted the dinner party for. I think the best thing about reading this book for me was kind of the preconceived notion that I was going to read strictly about your friendship with Ruth. And then I got to kind of witness all of these other amazing friendships. Like the first Supreme Court justice that you invited over to dinner was Justice Powell.
Yes. And I don't know where I got the chutzpah. I was probably in my 20s, and I was not married. I did the cooking. I invited them over. I don't remember if I invited anybody else. I think maybe somebody else, but I really don't remember. And they came, and they treated this little bitty house that I then owned, which was, like 13 feet wide. They treated this dinner as if it were at Buckingham Palace. They couldn't have been more lovely. And Justice Powell and his wife, Jo, remained my friends as long as they were alive. And I was very, very fond of both of them.
Mm-hmm. It's a very fascinating story. I think it's a good lesson too, in sometimes that you just need to ask the question.
One of the things I tell this story a bit in the book, but I have learned over time that the overlooked people in life, when I go to a big party and I don't know a ton of people, and I look around and there's somebody older sitting down with nobody talking to him or her, I immediately go over and sit down next to them and talk to them, because they're willing to talk, and they're often very interesting people. And I did that. I would go to lunch with Justice Powell after he retired, and I went to lunch with other justices or went to see them in some fashion or other. And I would go and talk with him. He was no longer a justice. There was nothing that he was doing at that moment that was ever going to be news. But he was freer to talk about his time as a justice than he would have been, contemporaneously when he was on the court. And I learned the most enormous amount from him that way about being a justice, about him, and about how to think about things even. And so I learned greatly from that friendship, but I learned the most probably after when he was off the court.
Mm-hmm. Jerry wants to know, how did you navigate avoiding topics that could have caused a conflict of interest with any of your friends, including Ruth?
Well, the ethic at the court really is, if you asked a question that might provide a conflict. So if I were to ask the justice, how's it going with Smith versus Jones, or something like that, or what really happened behind the scenes, I likely wouldn't have been, that person likely wouldn't have come to dinner again,
Mhm.
And I likely wouldn't have gotten to know them.
Mhm.
You have to navigate these things as friendships first. And maybe along the way, you learn something about how they do their job or whatever, or how they think about things. And maybe once in a while, you get a sort of a little hint from somebody, though never Ruth, about how pissed off they are about something.
Mhm.
But we were able to have that friendship because we both respected the boundaries. And I never had a friendship with anybody else like I had with her because we were so close in the latter years of her life. And because I traveled with her sometimes, even like when she was when the movie RBG came out,
Mhm.
I went to Sundance with her because I was going to interview her um, there, and it was a huge amount of fun most of the time, and uh, and it was very funny because just before I was going to do this interview, we were being um, we were being introduced by Robert Redford. And so I'm in the room with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Robert Redford, two people who are I learned this from Redford, in reality, quite shy. So they're not talking. They're not talking to each other at all. They're both sort of just sitting there, tap dancing like mad, trying to. I'm just being a chatty Cathy, trying to get something going. And I was so relieved when finally, we were ushered onto the stage and everything because they are both performers. They perform very well, but chatty Cathys, they are not.
That you say that in your book a couple of times, that Ruth is very shy, very, very shy, especially in social situations, but quite the performer. And it's just so hard to picture Justice Ginsburg as anything but this powerhouse.
She was an amazing performer. God knows how many times I interviewed her, including times when I knew that she was pretty sick, and you would never have known it. She would just be the big, that big self-confident person.
Mhm.
But um, and she wasn't that shy if she really knew you, but she had to really know you. And in a big crowd of people, when she would come to parties at our house, she knew when to come, which was late when the party was close, getting close to over. So there weren't 75 or 100 people there,
Mhm.
um, where she would be overwhelmed. There might be 20, and we would save some food for her and she would eat. And this is after Marty had died. And then whoever was there, I would chat with her, and whoever was there would sit down at this big table, and they wouldn't say anything. They just observe. And it was always young women, some of my husband's surgical residents, and some of my uh, former interns. And it was, it was fun, and she wasn't overwhelmed, and everybody got to sort of see her and
Mhm.
understand a little bit about who she was. But she was not, she was pretty. If she didn't have a purpose, give a speech, entertain people, um, give a lecture, those are one thing. But if she didn't have a purpose like that, she was a shy person, a very shy person.
Anne from Stoughton Public County Library is asking, what did your early conversations with Justice Ginsburg teach you about yourself?
How much I didn't know. I mean, I think they taught me how much I didn't know, because after all, I got tossed into covering the Supreme Court, and I'm not a lawyer. I didn't have the background for it. I have lots of law degrees, but they're all honorary at this point. I think I have like 20 some odd law degrees. They're all honorary. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. And she wasn't the only person that helped me. I would cold call a lot of people and say, I don't understand this. A professor or a judge, I'm reading your lower court opinion and I don't understand this. Could you explain it to me? And amazingly, they did.
Hmm.
People rarely said, no, I won't help you.
That's amazing. Because I think it's one of those situations where some people might feel too intimidated to ask. So again, it's just asking the question, and plenty of judges and lawyers are probably happy to be asked the question.
If you're a reporter, you better be able to ask questions.
Yeah.
That's the one thing I can do.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about all of these amazingly close friendships that you had with women throughout your career. And, not that you weren't competitive with one another or anything like that, but that you were still close. And Donna from Washoe County Library is asking, what happened to that? It seems this day and age, what is it that makes so many women unable to fully trust and engage in close relationships with other women? Have you had any experience with that?
No, I really have not. I don't know what Donna's talking about. I find that the easiest relationships to have are with especially coworkers,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where you spend such an enormous amount of your time. And it's one of the things that I think is one of the reasons that I really tell younger women they need to go back to work. I understand they have children, it makes it hard, but if you think about, I read in one of the newspapers, maybe 6 months ago, there was one of these, somebody saying, somebody said, people ask me, how did I make all these friendships? And the writer said, I made them at work. And if you want to prosper professionally and personally and make those friendships, I think it's the easiest place for younger women to make those kinds of relationships. A lot of older women who have retired sometimes make them traveling, or they make them doing charitable work. But when you're 25 or 35 or 45, the people you spend the most time with outside of your home are the people you work with. And if you're just going to sit holed up at home, you're not going to make those kinds of friendships.
Mm-hmm. So social media might be a detriment too for seeking friendship, because if you're constantly engaged with a screen, then you might not think that you need friends, even though you're probably still really lonely.
Oh, I don't think social media friendships are real friendships.
Yeah, I don't either. So with that, then, kind of that maintenance of the friendship, because I know there are plenty of people that even throughout my career, I've been very close with at work. And then if I switch a job, those relationships don't maintain. And Sarah from Orange County Library System is saying, in your book, you wrote, it is possible to be a great friend by doing some things, but not attempting to do everything. What is the one thing that you consistently do in your friendships to maintain them?
Be there when I'm needed. I mean, everybody has terrible things happen to them at some point or another. And that's when you show up. It's maybe just going to the hospital for 15 minutes several times a week with somebody who's in trouble, because Kohi taught me that 15 minutes was the perfect hospital visit. You don't tire the person out, but you've been there and you've made clear that you're there. Or a spouse dies, and you have to make sure that I mean, I've been married twice to two wonderful men, and my husband died. And my husband, my second husband, hopefully always second husband, we were widowed when we met. Not when we met, but ultimately we were widowed, and that's how we really started dating. And I we know what it's like, not right after your spouse dies, but a month later, and a month later, and a month later. And it's not the time to say, oh, I'll wait 6 months. No, you really do have to say, want to come to dinner?
Mm.
Um, want to come with us to the movies? You don't. It doesn't have to be a big deal, but those are the times to show up when there's something bad that's happened.
Mhm. Yeah, good advice. Christine from Kalamazoo Public Library asks how you think Ruth would feel about you writing a book about your friendship.
I think she'd have been okay with it. I think she would have been. I wouldn't have done it without asking her, but that I don't have a pipeline any. I didn't have a pipeline anymore, and I turned down a couple of offers to write books about her when she was still alive.
Mm.
Uh, Mainly because I didn't think I had anything that I could say. Because people who want you to write a book about a sitting Supreme Court justice, they want a book that's either a comprehensive legal look at the person or a personal look at the person. And truthfully, I never wrote down a damn thing that Ruth ever said to me. If I didn't remember it, and I've forgotten many more stories than I put in this book, because I never considered it. That wasn't the reason she was my friend. I
Yeah, why
didn't.
would you record it?
Yeah, exactly. Although if you know somebody that famous, maybe you ought to. But it never. I just. It just. It didn't occur to me, and if it had occurred to me, I wouldn't have done it.
Mm-hmm.
It would have made it not the kind of friendship I wanted it to be, and she wanted it to be. So, and I never found out anything from her that gave me a scoop either.
Mm-hmm.
I made some news sometimes with interviews I did with her, but that was for the world to see. That was not something behind closed doors or anything. That was everybody could see that. Um, and then there were interviews that I did with her that were, I did so many over the years that I used to joke that on occasion I could have said number 43 for this and say, tell us the story number 43. Uh, but I learned over time that when I knew I was going to interview her, like for example, at Sundance, I called her ahead of time. I said, it was right when the Me Too movement was just exploding. And I said, I need to talk to you about that in this interview. It would be, uh, as a journalist, we should do that. And I said, and so we chatted, and I said, did anything ever happen to you like this? And she said, oh, there's no woman my age that didn't have that happen to them, or your age. And we talked about it, and I asked her the question, and I got actually an answer I didn't expect. She told the story, which I tell in the book, but it was this professor who hit on her. She's 17 years old, and she's taking biology, and he hit on her, and she had gone to ask him. She was worried about her scholarship, and she'd gone to ask him what she should do to prepare for the exam. And he said, well, I'll give you a test exam. And then the test exam turned out to be the real exam. I mean, when she sat down to take the real exam, it was the same as the test exam. And so I'm listening to this story, and I said to her on stage, I said, so what did you do? Because all I thought I would have done is just never hidden away from him. I just wouldn't want to. She said, I went to see him, and I said, she's 17 years old. She said, and I said to him, how dare you? How dare you? That was the feisty Ruth.
I love that story. So, do you give any credence to some of the reviews that came out after the book by other journalists that state that you broke your oath as a journalist by not letting people know that Justice Ginsburg was dying?
Well, I didn't know she was dying. My husband knew she was dying.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know she was dying. I knew she was sick.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly knew she was sick, but everybody knew she was sick.
Yeah.
We all knew she was sick.
Yeah.
Her body parts all the time. So I didn't know she was really dying, I would say, until the last few weeks of her life. And at that point, I saw everybody knew how often she went to the hospital, or almost how often, because they would announce it.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't know that, you were a dumb reporter. And you can't pronounce somebody. I kept thinking that she might make it. She certainly might make it until after the election, which I knew she certainly wanted to do. But she didn't. She came very close, but she didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't regret that one bit.
Good. Well, we have time for maybe 2 more questions. We've got a lot of questions about people that you've interviewed over time, and some pretty general ones. So Bunny from North Branford Public Library says, out of all the people you've interviewed, who surprised you the most and why?
Surprised me the most?
Or who was, the most difficult, or maybe frightened you? Those would be very surprising things as well.
Well, if somebody agrees to be interviewed, they're not going to scare you. I mean, they've agreed to be interviewed. When I used to cover the Congress, in addition to all the other things that I used to cover, I would go down to just off, for example, the Senate floor, and you send in a note and you ask for Senator so-and-so to come talk to you. And it was almost always he in those days, came out, although there were a couple of women, would come out and talk to me. And a couple of times, Jesse Helms once berated me. He came out to berate me, as far as I can tell, because he never answered a question. He just came out and he said, "I hear you're a very pushy woman." And I said, "Well, I don't think you'd say that about a male reporter." And he stormed off. But for the most part, the hardest interviews are when somebody agrees to be interviewed and then doesn't want to say anything. That's the hardest kind of interview.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't, I've had a few. My favorite interview I ever did was of Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia together on stage, and they came to play, and they dueled, and they joked with each other, and it was my job to facilitate that. And you got a real sense of both of them and of their friendship. And it's one of my favorite interviews I've ever done, is that interview.
Mm-hmm. It's one of my favorite interviews of yours that I've ever watched too. So I'm happy to hear you say that. Okay, so what do you hope that readers take away from your memoir then? What do you hope they take away about the power of friendship?
Well, I hope that it gives them a sense of that it makes them laugh and cry, and it makes them think about their friendships and how to make them better, or how to just make sure you have them and stand by them, I think is the biggest thing I would say. There's some in the book also about the court itself, and I think it gives you a fairly good flavor of how different it was 15, 20, 30 years ago, and when there was a center on the court, not just a right and a left. And so I think I tried to make it a book that was not for everybody, but would both entertain people and teach them something about themselves and even about the court. Because after all, those are people too, and I've been very lucky to have some of those people, not just Ruth, as friends, and including Justice Scalia and Justice Brennan and Justice Powell and some others over time. And I learned a lot from them. I wish it were not such a divided court at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I think that's probably a fair sentiment amongst most of us. Okay, so I always like to ask favorite authors or what you're reading right now, but I realize you're probably just reading Supreme Court briefs right now.
That's exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm drowning in Supreme Court briefs. The mifepristone case, there must be, I haven't counted them. I would not be surprised if there are 100 amicus briefs in that case.
Oh, wow. I can believe it, though.
I don't read them all. Let it be said, I don't read them all. But I'm drowning. If the court is drowning in work, I'm drowning in work. So,
and the lawyers, I would venture to say, don't put their phone number on the front of the briefs anymore. So,
yeah, they do.
They do?
They have to. They're supposed to put their phone numbers. It may not be their personal office, but it's the law firm, at least.
The law firm, yeah. All right, Nina. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you today. Your book was beautiful, so thank you for sharing your memories and a little bit of your life with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, Nina.
Bye.
I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into our talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, in the Rate This Program tab, you can find a link to the resources area, which will contain a link to Nina's book. We look forward to seeing you all again on March 14th when we chat with New York Times bestselling YA author Christopher Paolini, and again on March 21st when we talk to bestselling and award-winning author Madeline Miller. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for